Meeting that we got today is Labour, Work and Alienation, and we've got Fran Manning, who's a teacher and a member of the SWP in Kingston. She'll be speaking for about 30 minutes, and then we're going to open up the floor for contributions, questions, etc. So without any further ado, Fran.
Thanks, Paddy. Hi everybody, and thank you for coming to this meeting and the start of the course on the Marxist method. So I think there's an aspect of our lives which should fill us with a deep sense of joy, that should make us feel part of a collective that's creatively shaping the world around us in order to satisfy human needs, but which instead hangs over us like a dark cloud, and it's called work. This is what Karl Marx was first and foremost talking about when he wrote about the idea of alienation. That under capitalism, our collective labour, which creates the world around us, the very thing which Marx thinks makes us human, becomes a terrible burden hanging over us. And instead of giving us a sense of fulfilment that we're contributing to the society that we live in, all too often work under capitalism feels like a chore, a punishment, and ultimately a prison. And out of this way in which the society that our labour creates becomes a force that oppresses us, Marx also believes that other types of alienation emerge. Alienation from other people, alienation from nature, and alienation from society in general. And understanding how these different relationships to ourselves and others and nature and society are broken by capitalism is really important to gaining an insight into why living under capitalism feels the way that it does. Marx really developed his ideas about alienation in the 1840s, and he first wrote about them at length in a document from 1844 called the Economic and Philosophical Manuscript. Now that's about 170 years ago, right at the beginning of capitalism's development. And there are some people today who would like to suggest that now his ideas are outmoded, and that the idea that workers fundamentally feel like their work is something which bears down on them, like an oppressive force, is overdramatic and really only an adequate description of factory life in the Victorian age. But I think actually that Marx's ideas are more relevant today than ever, especially with regards to alienation. In an age in which bosses have developed scientific control and surveillance systems which allow them to monitor and manage workers with cruel precision, in a time when millions work in completely socially useless jobs, like cold calling people to get them to change the company which charges them for gas and electricity, the concept of alienation remains an indispensable tool for understanding the experience of living under capitalism. But I want to start by talking about what Marx thought about human nature, because Marx had a very important philosophical insight that really bears into human nature, that really bears thinking about, and understanding it is really key, I think, to understanding what he meant by alienation. And what he essentially said is that human nature isn't fixed from one society to the next, and that basic things that can seem settled about human beings actually change from one age to another. So if you think about a lot of the common kind of things that we hear now, that humans are naturally selfish, or that men have always been the dominant gender, or that heterosexuality has always been the dominant form of sexual relationship in any society. All of this is actually wrong if you look at the historical records. In human prehistory, humans didn't compete with each other in the way that many now believe is normal. Early humans actually had to exercise complete cooperation in order to eke out a basic living from hunting and gathering. In the Neolithic age, there were matriarchal societies that were dominated by women. And in ancient Greek society, homosexual sex was the main form of recreational sexual activity. So if you look at the variety of ideas that people have subscribed to, the way that they've organised societies, and the kinds of sexual relationships that were normal in different periods, then really there's actually nothing which is common to all humans except for one thing. And that is the fact that we have to collectively work on the world around us in order to satisfy our material needs. And that, for Marx, is the essence of what it is to be human. It's being part of a collective, part of a given society which is trying to shape the world around it in order to satisfy its needs for food, clothing, recreation and culture. And vitally, humans work on the world around them consciously. Okay? Unlike animals, human beings can think about their work before they carry it out. Marx says, quote, A bee would put many a human architect to shame by the construction of its honeycomb cells. But what distinguished the worst architect from the best of the bees is that the architect builds the cell in his mind before he constructs it in wax. At the end of every labour process, a result emerges which had already been conceived by the worker at the beginning. So humans consciously plan their work, and therefore they can learn from previous generations and can build on the progress of the past. Marx says that humans work on the world, and in doing so, they change themselves too. Just think about the way that humans now look and behave, our individual capacity for rational and abstract thought. All of this has been completely revolutionised, really, by technological advances which have reshaped human civilization. So human nature allows humans to have a history and allows them to develop. And work, human labour, is at the heart of that history and of what it is to be human. It is human nature. And so we're most human when we're working on the world around us in order to change it and structure it according to our human needs. Now that's hard to think about under capitalism, isn't it? Because under capitalism, work is seen as something that you're paid for rather than something which can actually fulfil you. The things that are there to fulfil you are actually seen as sort of like frivolous, sort of like leisure activities that you do in your spare time. But if you think about actually some of the times when you've felt the most fulfilled, it's because you get a sense of achievement from working on the world and changing it and changing yourself in the process. Think about if you've ever made a piece of art or maybe tended a garden or decorated a room, some sort of project that really gave you an insight into the sort of creative potential that you have. Think about how you might learn a language or a musical instrument, that sense of freely developing as a person. These are ways that we can act on the world to change it and our relationship to it. It gives us a sense of control over our environment, and it's where we derive our sense of satisfaction and our identity. But of course that's not how capitalism makes us feel about what it narrowly defines as work. Because the work that we're paid for under capitalism is not for our own personal development or actually the general development of our society. The real reason that we go to work every day, even if in some sense actually it's a socially useful job, is that we're economically coerced into doing so. In capitalism, the workplaces, so the shops, the offices, the buses, the trains, the lorries, the distribution centres, the factories, this whole complex matrix of tools which workers actually need to labour on in order to sustain themselves are not owned collectively by the workers themselves, but are owned and controlled by a tiny elite at the top of society. And because of the way in which that tiny elite sustain their own positions, the work that we carry out is not actually done in order to produce useful things or to meet social needs. Work under capitalism isn't mainly directed at producing useful things. From the viewpoint of capitalist production, that's simply a byproduct. Okay. Work under capitalism is aimed at producing profit. This is how work is able to produce effects which are actually socially degenerative, carcinogenic pollution, junk food, nuclear missiles, all the other products of human labour that actually physically harm us and emotionally stultify us as human beings. And the actual feeling then of being at work is the feeling of being coerced by economic factors to work, not of being motivated by a vision and an understanding that we can contribute to a society, to the society around us and shape it into a better one in the process. And that has the effect of alienating workers from the very thing that makes them human, their ability to consciously plan how they work on the world. In fact, workers are so distanced from that power to change the world around them that they end up only feeling human when they're not working. Marx explains it like this. He says, the worker only feels himself outside of his work, and in his work he feels outside himself. He feels himself only free in his animal functions, eating, drinking, procreating, and at most in his home and in dressing up. In his human functions, he no longer feels himself to be anything but an animal. What is animal becomes human, and what is human becomes animal. I think the reason Marx likens being at work to feeling nothing but an animal is because it robs us of our creative potential, so that the work that we carry out is not the result of our own conscious effort to fulfil the needs and desires of those who consume the products of our labour, that's the type of labour that's part of human nature. The work that we carry out under capitalism is instead the result of orders from the boss in order to maximise production and to maximise profit. The conscious element of our labour is removed, and that's the very aspect of it that makes it human. Okay. And for anyone who works in a fast food place or a factory or a call centre, or as they've recently been called, the satanic mills of our time, yeah, quite rightly, I can say from experience, that shouldn't actually sound like an outmoded description of conditions in the Victorian era. Surprise, surprise, people don't actually live to work in McDonald's or in a call centre. People don't identify with those sorts of jobs. No one says, like, yes, this is the meaning of my life, feeding people burgers that give them heart attacks, or cold calling people and reading a script to them. They live, as many of us do, for the weekends, for getting drunk, for spending time with their romantic partners, for hanging out with their families, going for meals and dressing up on a Friday night. And fundamentally, the fact that work is felt to be alien to your life, something which intrudes on it from the outside and steals precious time, is a result of the fact that workers' labour in capitalism literally belongs to someone else. In capitalism, a boss buys a certain section of your life and you are forced to do their bidding for that period. In capitalism, you're not working to develop yourself or the collective, but to develop the profits of the person you work for. As such, you lose your connection to your own human nature. Marx says, the worker's labour is not voluntary but coerced. It is forced labour. The worker's activity is not his spontaneous activity, it belongs to another. It is a loss of his self. And this loss of self is experienced as a loss of control. While we're at work, we have no control over the labour process we're carrying out, and actually very little control over ourselves. We have to talk to and interact with people in the way that we're told. When I worked at a call centre, we had a script flow chart, so even our words weren't actually the result of our own conscious or creative choices. We can only eat and drink and go to the toilet at the times that we're told, and these breaks are usually monitored quite tightly. Anyone who's been late back from their break knows that. And we have to compromise our comfort and our health, whether that's swollen ankles from, standing for too long or waiting tables, a bad back from sitting for too long, bad eyesight from staring at a screen for too long, or lung cancer from breathing in toxic fumes. All of this, all of our physicality, all of our mental and cognitive functions, and even our emotive capacity to relate to others is totally subordinated to the logic of production and profit, and it is through this process that we experience this loss of control and loss of self. And with that loss of self comes a deep feeling of being trapped in a world that we didn't choose and cannot affect. Marx talks about the way in which the very reality that we create when we go to work every day comes to feel like an enormous prison. Despite the fact, actually, that the working class makes everything, produces in the factories, organises distribution in the offices, drives the trains, the buses, the lorries, opens the shops, the world feels not like our own creation, but instead like an inhuman machine in which we are simply replaceable cogs. The system which we keep moving, which is after all only a result of us getting up in the morning each day and going to work, or getting up at night, depending if you work in night shifts, comes to feel like something which is directed against our interests. And Marx says that this isn't a result of people naturally hating work. That is what the right wing tell us when they have to admit that work under capitalism is shit. They say, all work is so shit that you have to have a system that makes people work by paying them more to work harder and taking away benefits so that they starve if they don't work. Marx says no. It's not that people are naturally lazy, and so work feels like something that diminishes us. The way that work is organised under capitalism means that our labour does actually diminish us as humans. In fact, our labour is actually turned against us and becomes contrary to our interests as a species. So the things I mentioned before about the harmful effects of production. So instead of raising our living standards and freeing up our time for creativity and producing a more abundant and peaceful world, the economic advances that are a product of our collective labour as workers actually damages our way of life. The great advances in productivity, efficiency and social planning brought about by capitalism have not produced abundance or free time or creativity. They haven't fulfilled their potential, actually, of abolishing hunger and reducing the working week to a couple of days. Instead, they've produced a world where 1 in 9 people are chronically malnourished and where hundreds of millions are unemployed and impoverished while billions are overworked. So capitalism, often for ordinary people, feels like a prison over which we have no control. We don't decide what jobs exist. We simply have to turn up each day to the one that we can manage to get. We don't decide where our society is heading. And in many ways, that's not thought to be even in the hands of the bosses or the politicians or anyone really, because it's the market, the economy, which is seen as having some sort of will of its own and is outside the control of any human. And that's another aspect of what Marx understood by alienation, that social facts themselves, like the economy or the market or crime or fashion, come to look not like complex social processes that humans actually participate in and make happen, but like things with their own lives that dominate people instead. In his later work, Marx began to talk about the idea of commodity fetishism. In Das Kapital, he says that in capitalism, the social relations between humans assume the fantastical form of a relation between things. Social processes come to look like facts that have just always been that way. Think about the way in which the news presents the financial market, and it's that slot on the news immediately before or after the weather, precisely because the market is seen as this impersonal force like the weather that just simply happens. The increase and decline in the prices of various commodities are just the impersonal workings of the market. And this has the effect as well of naturalising capitalism. When thousands of jobs in the steel mills of Britain are threatened, this is represented as the natural workings of the market and outside human control, outside the control even of the Prime Minister or the government or capitalists generally. The rising rents forcing workers out of London are due to the workings of the impersonal property market, a fact that no one can change and about which nothing can be done. In this way, social processes become objects, things that simply are, and ultimately things that we have no control over. And this loss of control, this loss of self or alienation, has terrible effects. Marx was concerned with the impact of alienation on our physical and mental health. Marx argued that workers' lack of control over their working and private lives played a crucial role in explaining their ill health, and the research today continues to bear that out. There's studies discussed in a book called The Spirit Level by Kate Pickett, looking at inequality. And what it found was that even in countries where the poor are relatively well off compared to their counterparts maybe in the rest of the world, the mere existence of hierarchy and inequality impacts directly on mental and physical health. There was one study that looked at civil servants, and it found that having control at work was the most successful single factor explaining threefold differences in death rates between senior and junior civil servants working in the same offices in Britain. Another study done for the BMJ, the British Medical Journal, found that, quote, giving employees more variety in tasks and a stronger say in decisions about work may decrease the risk of coronary heart disease. I think that's quite a damning indictment, really, of the system that we live in, and proof, actually, that what Marx said is certainly still relevant. So when we become alienated from that which is most key to our human being, our ability to make the world around us, our work instead becomes like a jail that imprisons us, and the society around us becomes something alien which we feel powerless to affect. This has dramatic effects on our health in every sense. So how do we overcome this state of affairs? Well, I think the key thing to say, first of all, is that you can't overcome it simply by becoming more well-adjusted or confident in yourself. Today, writers make millions by turning out self-help books that will tell you that your sense of lack of fulfillment is actually a problem with you, not a problem with society. And if you feel like your life is out of control or empty, that's a matter of you looking at things from the wrong angle and making the wrong decisions. And maybe you need to follow these 7 steps to success. But alienation actually can't simply be thought away. You can't make it disappear by reading self-help books, or by subscribing to a Facebook page that gives you a daily affirmational meme, or by going to a mindfulness class. For Marx, the feeling of loss of control of a world that bears down on you isn't just in the mind, it's an aspect of material reality. It's an actually existing structure in capitalism. And therefore it can only be overcome by workers coming together and struggling collectively to impose democratic control over the system. And that's a process that Marx understood as working class revolution, of removing the control over production from the hands of a tiny minority and instead deciding what is produced, how it's produced and how it's distributed through democratic decisions by the mass of people. And in every revolution, in every class struggle, we've seen people beginning to overcome their alienation. From Muslims and Christians overcoming sectarian divisions and protecting each other during prayers in the Egyptian Revolution, to the strike committees of France in May 1968, which organised to support people's material needs, not just for workers, but for the old, the sick, the unemployed, and then to the mass surge of interest among workers in the Russian Revolution for art, culture, science and engineering as they attempted to grapple with an understanding of the society they lived in as they were trying to collectively reshape it according to the needs of the people. But we also see it in embryonic form on every picket line and on every protest. It's been there on the convoys that have taken aid to refugees at Calais. It's been there on the mass demonstrations in support of the junior doctors, and it will be there on Tuesday on the 5th of July when teachers all around the UK come out on strike for an education system that actually plays a positive role in people's lives. And it's through this process of coming together to impose democratic control over the system that we can begin to create a world not only free of alienation from ourselves and others and society and nature, but actually one suffused with an idea of social solidarity and an idea that we're collectively working to produce a world that is sustainable, peaceful, and lays the basis for human creativity and joy. Thank you.
I work in a school, similar to Fran, and I think one of the best examples of alienation that I can see is through the effects of testing and the sort of incessant Ofsted tests and learning walks, which not only cause the teachers to not be able to teach in a way that is fulfilling for them, it also removes the children's ability to actually enjoy themselves and pursue things in different ways. Like I'm working in year 6 and we've just come to the end of the year, and we see at the end of the year, after all the exams, you take them on the on a PGL sort of outward bound things, and lots of the children who might not necessarily have been the most successful in some of the traditional senses get their first opportunity to exceed in those activities which are completely separate. Many of the children who might be the best at maths and things might not necessarily be the most likely to climb up a tower and jump off it or something along those lines. And it really gives them the opportunity, and that really shows how some of the qualities in society that we really need and that we need to be pushing, and which are the things which would build a better society, get pushed to one side in the basis of making sure that we fill into this sort of cult of mathematics and box ticking and things like that.
Absolutely.
And I think the thing that makes it really relevant for today is that the digitisation of the workforce is going to push this sort of way it's been applied to teaching and things like that. It's happening in social work where you can only visit people for a certain amount of time. It's happening in the hospitals and stuff like that. It's even happening, my mum's an accountant, it's even happening in accountancy where sort of Sage and particular softwares are reducing people's ability to do certain things. And that's going to be the next thing that's coming over the horizon, where people who have been in traditionally middle class occupations are going to be proletarialised by the digitisation of their work.
I was just kind of wondering what Marx was saying in relation to the kind of alienation that's caused by the idea of competition that's instilled to us from very young. I mean, my feeling would be that humans are not really naturally competitive, we're naturally collective. Now, I think one of the first instances I was kind of reminded by the comrade who mentioned school is when you sit down in school and the child beside you is having difficulty with his son, the child's natural instinct is to help. But the teacher at the top of the class says, stop helping him. He has to do it on his own. Stop helping him. And I'm just wondering what Marx's sort of theory of alienation would say, and the kind of is that a contributor to alienation, that you can't help each other and nobody can help you because everything must be done on an individual basis and on a competitive basis, and wondering how that fits into our sense of detachment from the world or alienation from the world.
Right, my name's Danny. I've got a few things to go through on the basis of alienation. You're right, it does start in the schools where all kids are set targets and all challenge to each other to be at the top of the class, to be the best athlete, to be the best football player and all the rest of it. But since the 80s, it's been diluted inside the workforce, because the common thing with the workforce was we were a unit. We all worked together as part of the social network. You went outside of work, you had a community. Everyone knew their neighbours. I'm sure everyone here, if you look at yourselves, there's neighbours you don't know where you live, because they're not communities anymore. They've built us into individuals. And that's because they're doing individual targets. Promotion is built on individuals and somebody's friend now. There's a face-fits policy that's growing bigger and bigger. The businesses now have taken the banking system, the personal development reviews every 6 months for their middle management. The middle management are being crushed now, rather than they're being told what to do by the CEOs and people up above there, because their pay rises are based on it, their bonuses are based on it. You know, there's no longer a manager that's your department, or that's where you work. If you succeed, get a pat on the back. If it goes belly up, you get a kick up the backside. Late 80s, a lot of you will remember it, Maureen Lipman, the Mrs Jones adverts. I'm in here to buy that because Mrs Jones has got it. Right? We're now working for material things. We're now working because we're competing against our neighbour. Beforehand we were a community, now it's my neighbour's got that, I've got to have that. They've just got a new car, you've got to get a new car. And it's diluted everything we've ever believed in. It's diluted the unity. And now what we're doing is we're competing against each other, and we're giving capitalism exactly what they want.
Yeah, I just want to talk a bit about, like, we heard a wee bit about call centres, you know, the new dark satanic wills. I worked in a call centre in 2010 for about 8 months, and it was the biggest sense of alienation I've ever had. My boss took me downstairs at one point and she said, well, listen to this. She pressed play and I started off the call and I was like, hi Steve, you know, Steve speaking, you know, you're through to, you know, response. And then over the course of the call, my voice just started to kind of go. And she's like, you can't do that, like, you need to be where you're like at the beginning. And I just realised, well, I'm not me then, you know. And then she would also, in the morning, if you did well the day before, she'd get us to clap. Oh, give yourselves a round of applause. I stopped doing it and she kind of pulled me up. You're thinking, well, this is the world we live in a situation where congratulating yourself is personally insulting. It's just really odd, you know. But it's a funny thing, I used to do this, they'd listen into your call, the people upstairs, and your voice would echo, so you knew, but I pretended. I'd be like, to the customer, can you hear an echo there? I can hear an echo there. What's that? Like, can you hear that? And then the echo would stop. I'd be like,
I have some wonderful anecdotes, and I've also worked in a call centre, but it's similar in ways. I want to talk maybe a sort of glimmer of hope for alienation, and touching on what the comrade said about technological advances and digitisation in workplaces. Yes, it is threatening traditional white-collar jobs now as increasing automation through digital technology. Something you may not have heard about is the concept of universal basic income. So we can be emancipated through technology, and I think it offers a kind of a beacon of hope for people to become less alienated. as work disappears from all all levels of social strata, also all the social stratas, there's going to be a point where worklessness will be a huge. It is a problem now, and it will be an increasingly bigger problem, and there will need to be a settlement. Now, can we arrive at some sort of accommodation within the capitalist system, or do we need to kind of demand that world for ourselves? And I think we need to demand fully automated luxury communism for an end to alienation, in my personal opinion. That's all.
Can I just stand?
Yeah, of course, up to you.
I have a real struggle with Marx's description, or the need to compare the human to animals to justify and explain our need to work. And I'm just wondering how that, if it could be reinterpreted, given the new understandings about how animals function. For example, the way bees communicate with one another up to a meter of how far away the pollen is, and there's a deliberate intention. I mean, I'm not going to go into that, but I just wonder if there's any way of not needing to compare the intention to work and the planning ahead that humans do to what is seen as or misunderstood as a lack in how animals perform. Is that essential to Marx's theories?
I just wanted to highlight how we can look at the Russian Revolution in 1917 and how everything started becoming a communal thing. You'd have like communal kitchens where you could come in and get food up, you've been working, to communal creches where you could just drop with your kids, have free childcare. You had like everything was more or less turned into communal systems where people just felt a part of a group, you know, like you felt comfortable to ask people for help, you know, you felt comfortable to just be a part of a community, which was something I think we've lost quite a lot. You know, we haven't really got that at all. There's something else which was really I wasn't aware of, which I found out today, is like during the Russian Revolution, like schools became a much more of a democratic sort of system where teachers and students would kind of explore a subject together. You know, so if a kid had a question and it was quite a complex one, you know, they'd take time to actually develop on it. It's not saying they didn't have exams, didn't have like curriculums or anything like that. It was all a very organic way of learning. And I did have another point, but I completely lost it. Sorry. No worries.
Yeah, I kind of want to take up a little bit more of the discussion about new technology and about, you know, its potential in combating the alienation that we experience under capitalism, because on the one hand, I think, you know, it's really correct that at the moment capitalism has increased industry to the point that actually a lot of the jobs and the grueling labour that we do actually could be done by machines, and actually, you know that would be a good thing. I think, especially when you look at green technology, for example, and the oil industry. Actually, we don't need the oil industry. We know that now. If you look at the arms industry and all this stuff, all the production that goes on under capitalism that Fran has mentioned, that really isn't needed. And actually, the fact that we have huge technological advances that mean that actually we shouldn't be going back on climate change. Actually, we should be going forward on it. We should be combating it, and the technology and the advances are there. The technology and advances are there to actually free a lot of the household duties that go on up. But the question is, does capitalism have the potential to actually deliver these changes? And that's where I would really argue that the solution isn't necessarily a technological revolution, but it has to be a revolution organised by the masses and by the working class that then would drive through those technological advances. And the key thing comes back to, what does capitalism rely on? It relies on profit. Where do profits come from? Profit comes from wage labour. The capitalist takes off a section of the profits derived from workers' labour, pays the worker a little lump sum of money, which then we're able to go out and buy and continue the capitalist system and so on. And that's how the system keeps going. Without workers having a wage to be able to take part in society, capitalists would no longer get profits, and their system of exploitation and competition and a ruthless drive for profit would not be able to keep going. They know that. That's why they keep on exploiting us. Otherwise, they wouldn't be doing it. So I think you're absolutely right to say the technology is there, the industry that is there. I mean, just look at the pharmaceutical industry. It's despairing to think that people, especially in countries like America where there's no national health service, are dying because they do not have access to, to new technological advances within the pharmaceutical industry, which means that, we could be reversing things or stopping things like cancer and so on. Why is this? It's because of profit. So absolutely huge possibilities as far as technology goes. The question is who can deliver it? That's the working class. So we need workers to be collectively thinking about, organising, fighting back, and then saying we could implement all these advances.
Yeah, I work in support. I'm a support worker up in Newcastle, and I think it's an interesting industry because you think about it, you think it's very empathetic. You get something at the end of the day, you're rewarded, but yet somehow you're still alienated. You're still alienated from your labour, and I think it goes back to the question of looking at how we live in a hierarchical society and how we're judged on our success on how much money we earn and stuff like that. And I think it's really important to see that just so someone works in finance who actually makes no money at all in terms of start again. just as someone works in finance, it doesn't mean that they're more successful than someone works in care, for example. But I think it's a complicated industry. I mean, where I work, the staff are so divided. I mean, the things that we could do for these people, the things that we could achieve together. I mean, if you look at things like you look at Spain, where their social health care system is completely different. I mean, in this country we have hundreds of thousands of support workers, care assistants, but in places like Spain and the Mediterranean, that's a lot less. And I think it comes down to things like communities and how communities have developed in this country. In other countries, I know there's some health and social care in Spain, but they tend to look after their elderly and their people with disabilities a bit more, And I think, every society's, every country's worked out in a different way, but in this country, there's something really strange about that, the fact that we've got this kind of like, I have to go and I get paid, but I want to do this anyway. We should all be doing this, And I think if we look to a future society, a socialist society, we think, the things that we could achieve together, and how we could include people with disabilities and how at the moment they're sort of cornered off, and we're still getting over that hurdle, I mean, it was only 40, 50 years ago they were putting these mental institutions and classes crazy, these people, but actually they're the most fun in the world, and they can do things that you never thought was possible. I mean, I came into my industry and I thought, these people, I had my own conceptions of it, and even as a socialist I thought, we'll see how this goes, but these people are amazing, and they should be given opportunities, but because of capitalism's drive for profit and drive for greed, these people are isolated and put to one side, and I think we've got a lot to overcome, but we see... Is that a tap?
Yeah, sorry.
It's alright, got off there. So we're alright. But obviously the logic of it is profit, but I think, long term we can look to how we cooperate as a society, how we come together as a society, and I think that is the way forward. And one example of that is the junior doctors. In my workplace, I only work with a few women. It's all women pretty much in our industry, and to be honest, at times it's quite reactionary. A lot of the sexism comes from themselves. I'm not sexist, hopefully, and it gets really divided. But the junior doctors dispute really opened up a way where we could communicate and actually talk about the way forward.
Come to the question, I think it was you, about the lumpenproletariat, so-called, because I think that is a term that was used, in the 19th century, and certainly not one that we tend to use today. But of course, we know what it means, and I think it's important to note that capitalism creates that concept of people who are useless, of people who can't contribute. And when they say contribute, they mean do a job which can make a profit for the system. They don't mean contribute to human society or to the actual needs of people or any of us as a collective. And I think that what we want to reject is the whole definition of what's useful, of what work is, in the way that Fran was talking about, that we would want to go back to a much broader concept of human labour, which can be anything. I think in Capital Marx talks about savouring a peach, and you know, it's just interacting with the world around us and you know, kind of developing in that way. So I think that the whole problem with capitalism is that it creates specific classes, you know, a working class, which is defined by its ability to contribute to profits for the capitalists, and then that creates all kinds of people who are not able to do that either because they're pensioners, you know, they're too old to continue working that way, they're disabled, whatever it is, or their children, and they're not yet able to contribute. And it throws them on the scrap heap, lots of those groups of people. We want to abolish class because we don't just want to, you know, take the wealth and the power away from the minority who currently have it. You know, if you abolish the ruling class, and I don't mean necessarily the individuals, depends if they play along, but I mean, you know, if we abolish the concept of the ruling class, of there being a minority who have that control, then we're also abolishing the working class, because you can't have bosses without workers and vice versa, you can't have masters without servants, and we don't want either. You know, socialism is about from each according to his abilities to each according to their needs. You know, that means abolishing all of those divisions that actually distort the whole concept of what humans can contribute to society and distort it. So for us, talking about the power of the working class is about confronting the reality of this society in order to change it into a different one where everyone is valued.
After this comrade, you have the comrade right at the far corner. Yeah.
Thanks, and thanks for a very lucid and really interesting talk. And you mentioned mindfulness and those forms of self-improvement that you've linked together that I would separate out. I feel there's a genuine thread within that, and I feel there's a very unauthentic thread within that, which does exactly what you say, just throws people back onto resources which aren't there effectively in an inauthentic, counterfeit way. But this is something that seems to fit within the idea of alienation in this topic, and something that I'd like to know more about with Marx. Is that I feel that the attitude towards religion is perhaps, in my is perhaps a fundamental error. Okay, don't throw anything, please. In my ignorance of Marx, I don't know a lot about him at all. I'm here the first time to kind of learn. But my experience of mindfulness and meditation and so on is that it provides a space within which the individual can start to know themselves, and that I see a lot of people running out into activity with insufficient knowledge of themselves. And I think that is, there's a quote from somebody, a French guy, who said that the whole problem with the world is, he put it in terms of man and mankind, is man's inability to sit in a room alone with himself effectively. And that I think the rush to action can be the thing that creates problems when people don't have sufficient knowledge of themselves, their inner workings, the fact that the line that divides good and evil runs not between one people and another, but through, as somebody else said also, the heart of every individual. And so, and my experience personally is that I found an enormous resource there, not a sufficient resource, but a resource for personal strength to take out into the world. And so if I summarise the question, is in contemporary society now, is modern thinking that Marx was fundamentally absolutely right, or is it perceived that perhaps there's room for those things as well as, of course, collective struggle?
After this comrade, we have a comrade at the front.
I want to just come back to the comment that gentleman made about alienation starting at school. I know what you meant, but I think that actually when you try and understand the impact of alienation, I think it starts before you're even born, in a sense, because if you think about the context of a woman deciding she wants to have a child, and the decisions that she has to make in terms of whether she can do that, so can she afford it, can she get time off, can she get decent maternity care depending where she lives in the world, all those kind of things start to affect the quality of life that a child's going to have and the experiences that that child's going to have when they're born. So you end up, with a very, very simple sort of class divide, don't you? For most working class women, we know that it's expensive to, get nursery care. We know that, there's a battle on about standards at schools and all that sort of thing. We know that, for most kids, that a lot of the ideas that they have in terms of their future and what society is going to deliver are actually formed, when by the time they're 3 or 4 in many ways, aren't they? And so what we see at the moment in terms of the world we live in is, sure starts being attacked, children being forced back to very privatised care. For most kids, I'm an ex-social worker, so I'll trump the 4 sentences. But that notion that actually the most vulnerable group of children are under 3, are the kids who are under 3, because they spend most of their time at home with nobody else around them, very little socialisation, and that's not the fault of mums and dads. That's the fault of a system that basically says that we don't value little children, particularly working class children, until they become of an age where we can start to completely throttle them in terms of ideas and all those kind of things, minimise their creativity, all that type of thing. Actually, what a world we live in says that is that they will be brought up in a very privatised, very isolated existence, and actually the ideas that go with that to justify that, amongst working class people there's a big debate about whether nursery care is a good thing. I think it's brilliant, but for a lot of people it feels like your child's being taken away, being pushed into another arena in that sense, and therefore it is very, very threatening. And I think it's important because by the time you get to school, you already think that you should wear pink as a girl, you should play with dolls if you're a boy, that you do tractors, you do manual, all those ideas start to become formed. And then I think, despite the best efforts of teachers, the education system reinforces that and reinforces that education is for your job rather than for pleasure, all those kind of things. So I think that we end up with a situation that it's almost defined for ordinary kids, isn't it? And, to be honest, for the ruling class as well, in terms of their alienation exists as well. It's a different one and a more comfortable one, but they're still alienated. But it's almost, defined for you before you hit 5. And the struggle for us as teachers and as workers is to say we reject, the gender stereotypes, all those kind of things, because we want a world that looks at our potential as opposed to what use we've got in terms of making a profit.
After this, comrade, we'll have you then.
Going to the cleaning personnel of this institution or a construction worker and telling them, Karl Marx said that work is what makes you human. I mean, my reaction was, fuck off along with Marx. But I'm starting from this because capitalism goes, and alienation in capitalism goes further than what work is. And I want to speak about hobbies. In capitalism, hobbies are, in my opinion, a byproduct of alienation. And I don't mean hobbies are bad. I mean, I live in Switzerland and I've got my small Swiss agenda, and I go like, in next Friday I've got 30 minutes left. I'll be able to go running for 30 minutes, and yay, I've got those 30 minutes. It's really one of the moments, or the moments in our life when we feel free. But the truth is that even hobbies under capitalism take a really specific form. For workers, they are not the expression, the need, or the expression of our need to be creative in itself, but they take the form of our need to escape the tyranny of work. And I'll quote Theodor Adorno, a quite dark Marxist, because I don't like quoting, but sometimes you've got to admit that others have said things better than you will. So, and I'll be translating this from French directly, so forgive me for any mistakes. He says that he talks about sports, and he says that sport promises to liberate the human body from the humiliation to which it is subjected by economic interests. That is its magical attraction. They give us back a part of our functions that we have lost, that has been stolen from us by the industrial capitalist society. But in fact, they cannot give us the escape that we need. Entertainment in advanced capitalism is an extension of work. It is sought for those who want to escape mechanized work, the procedure of mechanized work, in order to come back and face this procedure again. Sport actually take the place for the people. Yes, actually, sport come in people's life only to give them back some of the functions that have been stolen from them by the machine, but only to subject them again in a merciless way to the needs of this machine. Okay, so I've quoted this like quite in a difficult way because it's been difficult for me. But what Donna says here is what I wanted to say in the beginning, is that even if we can escape for 30 minutes, 40 minutes, 2 hours, 10 hours per week in capitalism, capitalism offers us this small, short moments of liberation, of creativity, only to bring us back and in a better shape, and to subject us again to the needs of the machine.
At the back. Yeah. No.
I just wanted to come back to the comrade who spoke quite a few people ago, Irish comrade, was talking about what Marxism says about children learning. And we used to always have at Marxism a meeting about Vygotsky, who was a Soviet, an educationist really, although he's always seen as an educational psychologist, which is the job I do. But he was part of the great flowering of culture and ideas that happened during the Russian Revolution. And what he said was that a child's potential was really shown in an area that he called the zone of proximal development. If you're a teacher, you'll know this. The zone of proximal development was what you were able to achieve working in cooperation with a more able peer who was just a little bit further ahead of you. So his idea of learning was what you could do in cooperation. I don't want to say any more than that, but you really need to have a look at Vygotsky. I don't think that his ideas can come to fruition under capitalism, but I think we get little glimpses of that in really high quality primary teaching, where we do get kids to work together and we have things like talk partners and things like that. Unfortunately, it's all the kind of testing and things that squeezes those activities out of the curriculum, but really good teachers still kind of preserve some of those activities, and unfortunately it tends to disappear a bit in secondary school. But you know, there are contradictions in this thing. You know, there are little things that people hang on to and preserve, and I think, you know, we have to fight to keep those little spaces of creativity that remind us what things might be like after capitalism.
After this, comrade, it's
I was going to talk about how alienation affects workers' confidence as well. I mean, I've worked in quite a few different industries in varying levels of jobs, and what I've found repeatedly is that workers know how to do their jobs. I mean, it's based on Marxism. They have the means of production. They know what they're doing, but because of the hierarchical systems that they've had throughout their whole lives, all the way through school, they've lost their confidence. And when they meet with a new situation, and if they were in their private lives, they'd be able to deal with this. But when they're in work, they hit with this crisis of, what if I do something wrong? What if I'm reprimanded? What if I'm not following exactly the right procedure? And I feel that really ties into the alienation. It's just a really brief point. And I just want to come back on the universal basic income. Yeah, it sounds like a nice idea and a nice reformist idea to further workers' rights, and they remove the immediate need to work. But unfortunately, without real market controls like price controls, rent controls, it's just impossible. And they're not. I don't think they're the kind of controls that any state is going to bring in, because it is too much market interference that they just won't hand. Because we have to have the invisible hand of the market. That's what guides us through all our lives and what will tell us how we need to live.
Referring on to your film, please. I just want to say, Fran, you explained the alienation of labour very well. I understand, like, the alienation comes from being like a kind of cog in the wheel of production and then profit, essentially. But the issue of like being creative, being creative being and what that involves. I really want clarification on that, like, because how, like, in a socialist society, what would that mean in practical terms? As someone who is a road sweeper, factory worker, how would that creativity come through? How would you be able to, like, stimulate your creativity in those kind of jobs? That's all. Thank you.
And then you'll be the final speaker, and then I'll bring Fran back.
Yeah, I was just going to also talk about what people are calling post-capitalism, and Nick Smirnick and Paul Mason and writers around the idea that the increase in technology sort of lays the basis for, like, you know, a workless society or a fully automated society. And as people have pointed out, you know, these are some of the demands are very supportable, such as for a basic universal income, and you know that would weaken capitalist hold over us. But I also agree that the way technology is used under capitalism actually harms workers. So, I mean, two examples. One is that my dad was like a printer, and at some point eventually a lot of printers' jobs just disappeared. And you know, capitalism didn't look after them. They just said, we've increased the technology and you're all unemployed now. Yeah. The other side of it is also, you know, workers in warehouses now get timed, even how fast they move and so on, which is based on technology under capitalism. But reading Nick Smirnick's book, Inventing the Future, as well, I mean, what he says is that he really looks to the Syriza model of, like, you'll get a left-wing government elected and you also have a movement as well. And I think what the speaker outlined in terms of alienation is that that's not, like, good enough, that you don't want a sort of slightly nicer form of alienation. If you think that alienation's not natural and a good way to run society, what you really need is revolution, and that is ordinary people taking control of their own lives and over society.
So it's more of an observation in that I happened to be in a hotel. I was working for the XL for an event for carers, those in domiciliary and residential care. And I'd come back up from working, gone up to my hotel room, and on my way in, I noticed a bell porter, and I observed that before he knocked on someone's door, he breathed a real deep, heavy sigh, and he went, and then knocked. And then I came again another day and saw him do the same thing, and it just sort of echoed Wells, down and out in Paris and London, and what you were saying, Fran, in terms of these jobs that are, I suppose, really redundant. They don't necessarily need to be done. It was room service, so there's nothing to really stop someone maybe going to the cafe and you know what I mean? And you could just tell, I felt real, like, gosh. But then I thought, in terms of the comrade you had mentioned, and yeah, technology is a future for us. Would it be that the technology would replace that particular bell porter, they'd come up with food and like a dumbwaiter? But then what my question would be, would it just be a movement of another job role being changed? So instead of the person being the bell porter, you've got the person fixing the technology, making sure it's running smoothly. So is it just a matter of things just being shifted from one job role to another? That was my query, my observation.
Last contribution just at the back there.
Yeah, I just wanted to say, like, comments about exploitation alienation, as soon as, like, you're based abroad. A couple of months ago, I was my son had the TV on, just gave an instance where he had Fury Store on, and then what basically happened was we started working with somebody selling sweets, so we gave them all for free, and then the boss he worked for went nuts because he gave it all away for free and there was no profit. And that, so basically, my son's 19 months, so it was basically like, I thought, well, that a program built for this is showing you the alienation of profit at 19 months. Just shows you, I never really normally listen to the program. I was like, wow, basically giving you capitalist structure, there. That's all I want to say.
Thank you so much to everybody. That was a really, really good discussion and fantastic points, and great to hear about people's different experiences and some really interesting questions asked. I'm not going to be able to come back on all of the questions asked, so I'm really sorry. Some people have obviously already answered some questions and stuff, and please, if I've missed your question out and you really like to chat about it, feel free to come up at the end and have a chat about it. The question about animal labour and about why we need to, or why Marx distinguishes human from animal labour, and is it kind of a slur almost against animals and what they do? I think that the reason Marx talks about animal labour as distinct from human labour is because he's making the point really that animals don't develop because they don't have the what I talked about in the start of the meeting. So because they don't, they're not able to conceive of what they want to produce at the end of the process. This means that they're not able to develop and learn from history and develop a history. And I think that Marx talks about that because he is talking about what is human nature, as distinct from any other living thing. He is specifically talking about human nature. I don't think it's kind of diminishing or anything like that to other living things. On creativity, the question about what would creativity mean under a socialist society? I mean, just one of the examples you said, like a factory. I think it would mean, creatively deciding. You come together to make the choices over what you're making in that factory, how you're making it, and how you're distributing it. So, you might be making something that you actually think, well, this product would actually be a lot better if it was, made with these materials or whatever, and you'd actually be able to implement that rather than just sort of thinking, well, that would be a good idea, and maybe I'll put it in one of those like boxes that some workplaces have for like suggestions, but then never actually do anything that's in the box. And maybe you'd also decide that you wanted to distribute it for free, or make it free to certain people, whatever, depending on what sort of stage of socialism you were living in. The question about, or the point that somebody made about, I'm going to call it individualisation. I think that's a word. In terms of the society that we're living in now, capitalism as it currently is, making us compete with each other or intensifying competition between people. I think that this is actually, I don't think this is a conspiracy of the capitalists. I think it's a necessary side effect of neoliberalism. I think it's part of I think it's come about specifically because capitalism has tried to squeeze out as much extra profit as it can. I think that the kind of way that people feel that communities have disintegrated, I think actually that's not necessarily because of propaganda or some sort of like big plan by the capitalists. I think it's partly to do with the housing crisis. People are living in places for much less time and have to move out because your rent's constantly getting put up or whatever, so people are staying in communities for a lot less time and moving around a lot more. Also, people are working a lot more, like working hours since sort of like when people think back to like really good communities and stuff around like the 1970s or 1980s, people's working hours have increased massively. So I think that I would say that there has been certainly a breakdown of sort of like, or to some extent, disintegration of communities. But I don't think that that's happened deliberately. I think it's part and parcel of capitalism's strategy, basically, to try and get profit rates back up. And I'm not really sure that people are actually competing any more than before, though. I have to be honest. I think. Somebody talking about people being stopped from helping each other. Yeah, like the kids in my classroom, they, I like to let them help each other, but sometimes if they're doing tests and stuff, I'll get told off if I let them do that. But do you know what's really funny is that they still do it. No. You tell them not to do it, and they just still do it. And people do it as well. People do it all the time. Like, in work, maybe, all right, you're not really supposed to like let the person through the barriers at the train station, but you let them through anyway because whatever. I think that actually people do still have that kind of like desire to cooperate with each other and help each other. And I think that bosses actually put like quite a lot of thought there's quite a lot of effort put into trying to like diminish that cooperation. You think about, you get all this like employee of the month stuff and different ways to try and make people compete with each other. But I don't think I think in that sense, like that aspect of human nature is actually quite resilient. When you think about what it's up against. To finish then, I was going to talk about the fully automated luxury communism. I don't really think I need to say much about that. I mean, the Michael Roberts talk yesterday, which was quite good, about sort of like artificial intelligence and robotics. I mean, we're about like a century away from actually being able to replace human labour in any sort of serious form, and capitalism going on for another century could quite easily mean actually the mutual destruction of the contending classes. Basically that everyone would die because of the internal contradictions in capitalism, like the fact that it causes climate change or war. So I think that we will have to look for another solution in the meantime, which is going to mean organising to overthrow it, basically. And to finish then, I'll just talk about the point that somebody made about religion and meditation and mindfulness, which I'm going to say right from the outset, I think those are two separate things. On religion, Marx actually said, I think sometimes this point is sort of overplayed about what Marx actually said about religion. Marx called religion the heart of a heartless world. He called it the sigh of the oppressed creature. I think that certainly you wouldn't get from what Marx is saying there that religion is something awful. But I think actually you won't find, generally on religion, you won't find one interpretation among Marxists on what the position of Marxists should be to religion. And so even within the Socialist Workers Party, you'll find differences of opinion on that. Personally, I think that organised religion has often played quite a reactionary role, but also people's interpretation of religion has at times played quite a revolutionary role as well. The idea that we should be helping each other, or we should be living in a world that's fair, or whatever. And I actually, my personal position is that, I think that we can't really begin to even know about anything like beyond this life until we actually get rid of capitalism, which oppresses us and kind of distorts us and stunts us. And stunts our development, really. In terms of mindfulness, I've been to mindfulness classes. I think they can be certainly helpful for dealing with the society that we live in. Right? They can be helpful in terms of helping you cope with it. But let's be honest, mindfulness is about literally putting the world out of your mind and putting the future out of your mind. I saw this this meme on Facebook that was about why you should do mindfulness or something, and it was like a man walking his dog, and they're in the park, and there's like a thought bubble coming off the man and the dog, and in the man's or in the dog's thought bubble, it's the man and the dog walking in the park. Whereas in the man's thought bubble, it's like a house and a car and like something that represents his job and all this different stuff. And what it's saying is that, you're stressed because you're thinking about all these different aspects of your life and your future and stuff. But actually, I think shouldn't that be something that's nice to think about? Shouldn't that be something that fills you with joy to think about your future and about wider society? It's because of the way that our lives are shaped by capitalism currently, and the way that society is shaped by capitalism currently, that becomes something that's really horrible to do and gives us panic attacks and gives us anxiety and depresses us. That is the reason that we need to put it out of our minds at times for our mental health. It's about, mindfulness teaches you to relinquish control, right? To forget about having any sort of idea of control over the future or society. And I understand why people want to do it, and I've done it myself before, and I'll probably do it again in the future. But I think as a strategy for overcoming alienation, it's not going to work. I think the only way that we're going to overcome alienation is by, as I said at the beginning, coming together collectively, first of all to overthrow capitalism, and then to build a new society that takes care of all people, really. And I think that if you're not a member of the Socialist Workers Party, you should join, because we want you to help us do that. Thank you.